thank everyone for coming out tonight. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Young America's Foundation for sponsoring this event. This lecture is part of the Fred Allen Lecture Series. Events like this would not be possible without the generosity of individuals like Fred Allen, so we are extremely grateful. Finally, I would like to thank the members of the College Republicans, university administration, event services staff, police officers, and everyone else who helped make this event possible. We put a lot of planning into it, and I hope you enjoy the lecture. Now, before we begin, I've been asked to read the statement that the university released this week. Freedom of speech and the vigorous exchange of ideas are core values at UConn. To preserve those fundamental freedoms, we must allow people to speak without interruption during events, including invited speakers and audience members during the question and answer sessions. Preventing people from exercising their rights goes against our identity at the university, and anyone who does not follow these rules may be removed by event staff. Thank you. Now, this event will consist of a lecture followed by a Q&A. I would encourage any of you that have questions, I'm sure there are 500 of you, I'm sure we can think of a few questions, to come up after the lecture is given and participate in the wonderful thing that we call the exchange of ideas. The First Amendment is fundamental to the university setting, not only our great nation. So, thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest for the evening. Mr. Shapiro is editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire, the fastest-growing conservative talk show website in the nation. He's also host of the Ben Shapiro Show. I'm sure many of you are fans. A Fox News contributor and a conservative commentator. Now, I won't take any more of your time up because I'm not that interesting. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome onto the stage Mr. Ben Shapiro for our lecture.
Foundation and the College Republicans for having me. I want to thank particularly the university for providing the level of security they felt was necessary for the event, so a round of applause for the security. Looking forward to having a nice cordial event where we exchange ideas and don't yell at each other and don't steal notes. By the way, if you do try to steal the notes, number one, I must warn you, there are a few people who may attempt to prevent you from doing that. And number two, I have hidden copies of my speech under every seat in this room. So you get a speech, and you get a speech, and you get a speech. Everyone gets a speech. Administration for allowing this event to go forward. I only wish that their safety protocols extended to allowing members of the general public to show up. I know I got dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of emails from people in the general area who were hoping to get in, were unable to do so. I had heard that by the time of this event there were another 500 or 600 people who wanted to come at minimum, and it's unfortunate that the heckler's veto still seems to prevail. Anita Hill spoke here, I guess, in the last couple of weeks, and it was totally open to the public. Something has to be done about a system where a few crazed leftists decide they don't want to hear somebody speak, and therefore people from the outside who pay taxes to universities like this one can't get in. That has to stop. This heckler's veto nonsense where somebody on the left prevents speech, we all have to make sure that no one can get in from the outside. That really needs to end, particularly because free speech, I mean, this should be a shining moment for this university, not just because I'm so brilliant and I'm here, but also because it's a great thing that universities have people like me, and yes, like the person who's speaking opposite me on this campus, to give a variation of ideas. That's a wonderful thing, and it should be a shining example for universities around the country. It's just too bad that they won't share that with people in the community who are paying for it. So frankly, I'm always amazed a little bit by the amount of upset that my speech has caused. Apparently, I've heard that I'm a danger to the student body in some way, so much so that the university's Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, the most useless title in all of academia, sent a letter suggesting that students who feel threatened by my presence should reach out to the cultural centers, the Dean of Students' Office, or the university's Office of Counseling and Mental Health Services. So I actually sent a letter that said, quote, "We understand that even the thought of an individual coming to campus with the views that Mr. Shapiro expresses can be concerning and even hurtful." Wow. And that's why we wanted to make you aware as soon as we were informed. I mean, it's like a missile being launched from North Korea. You just have to put the alert system on Twitter. I agree, by the way. If you are so upset by my very presence on this campus, first of all, my guess is you didn't show up. Second of all, if you're that upset that you actually have to go to mental health services, I would just suggest that you probably need to see mental health services about a fair number of other things in your life. Speaking of which, of course, the College Democrats are holding an event simultaneously right now, which I'm sure has just the same number of people. This event, I guess, is dedicated to just debunking me. So there's some guy who I'd never heard of until like the last 5 minutes, who apparently runs a website that no one had heard of until he wrote a piece about me. So I am excited that I am a one-man stimulus package for academia. I'm creating an entire cottage industry of useless people who now have found a use, and it's just yelling about things that I say, so that's exciting. I have heard also that this person is a socialist, so I hope that they're getting paid. I hope this guy's getting paid, and maybe he can be drawn into the great market that is the United States, and maybe be cured of his foolishness. I do find it sort of amazing, by the way, that the left is so afraid of open conversation that they scheduled an event at the exact same time. And I think that they should totally have their event, and they should have their event yelling at me and all of that. That's great. But I would prefer that they actually come to this event, and then they can ask questions, because when we have the Q&A session, I have one simple rule. If you disagree with me, you raise your hand and you go to the front of the line. I prefer speaking with people with whom I disagree, not only because it makes for great internet fodder, but also because discussions are useful. I've spent my entire life in places like Los Angeles and Boston, places where no one agrees with me, literally no one agrees with me, and I have fun conversing about these views. I think it makes me sharper, it makes the person I'm talking to sharper, so everybody will have their shot. Right? If you're on the left and you disagree with the stuff I'm about to say, then you'll have your opportunity. I just wish the College Democrats had participated in that rather than simply walking out, taking their ball, and going home like small children. And this is an upgrade, by the way, from what Antifa usually does. So I'm glad they're having an event and not trying to disrupt this one. I have a feeling that has to do with a couple of things. One, there's actually security. And two, it's really cold outside, and as a member of my security team told me, they are fair weather protesters. So apparently they wrote a letter to the student newspaper saying that I am a racist and ensconced in white identity politics, which is asinine. I've been one of the loudest critics of the alt-right in America for at least the last couple of years. I was the #1 target of the alt-right according to the Anti-Defamation League. I received almost 8,000 tweets in a 6-month period that targeted me in anti-Semitic fashion, largely from the anti-Semitic alt-right. But apparently Antifa is upset particularly because I, quote, overlook the need for ethnic studies and diversity-related education in the United States. That's fair. And they should be angry. If we did away with useless college classes, how could they get easy A's that allow them to have jobs in useless professions at universities like this one? Now, make no mistake, I'm not saying that people of diverse backgrounds and orientations and races shouldn't be on this campus. They absolutely should. Everybody who's qualified should be on this campus, obviously. What I am suggesting is that if you are judging the quality of a group of people by the color of their skin, this makes you the racist, not me. And if you're looking at a group of people and you say this group of people is better than that group of people simply by dint of the variation in melanin, then you're doing something wrong. There's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with me for suggesting there's something wrong with you if you're judging people simply by their group identity rather than as individuals. Okay, so today I want to talk about something slightly different. That is this pernicious phrase that's been going around. The phrase, of course, is your truth. So I'm getting very sick of this phrase. If anybody watched the Golden Globes, all three of you, then you saw Oprah Winfrey give the greatest speech in the history of mankind. I mean, the media it was the best speech anyone has ever given. It was better than all three of Churchill's great speeches from 1940. It was better than the Gettysburg Address. It was better than Ronald Reagan's Shining City on the Hill. It was better than the speech that Adam Sandler makes in The Waterboy. It was better than all of these. It was so fantastic. It was amazing. And you know why it was so great? Because Oprah said that no one can stand against your truth. You see, you have a personal truth, Okay, this is absolute, not to define points on it, bullshit. Okay, the idea that you have a truth is not right. Okay, there's no such thing as your truth. There is just the fact and your opinion. Okay, you don't get to make things up and then call it your truth. And if you have a story, and your story can be verified, then it becomes the facts. If it can't be verified, it's your subjective opinion of what happened. Right, but this conflation between the facts and your opinion is really, really pernicious. Unfortunately, a lot of folks on the left don't want to hear this. They love this phrase, your truth, because it allows them to disguise their opinion as the facts. And more importantly, it allows them to disguise the facts you cite as your opinion. So if I cite a fact, it becomes my opinion. If I say something that I'm quoting the New York Times, it doesn't matter. If it conflicts with their feelings, now I'm speaking in the realm of opinion. I'm conflicting with their truth. So we're going to do a little exercise here. Okay, here's the exercise. I'm going to give you a list of facts on a variety of topics. These are all facts. These are not opinion. Okay, and you will see there will be some people who are very offended by these facts. There are people on the left who will be offended just by the fact that I'm saying facts, right? Just by the fact that I'm without even drawing a conclusion. I will reserve my conclusions about these facts until the end of the speech. But I'm going to give you a bunch of facts in a row, and people are going to get really uncomfortable. They're going to feel really difficult about this stuff, because here's the reality. If you base your opinion on the facts, this may force you to come to some conclusions you wish you didn't have to come to. The facts may conflict with your truth. So let's go through a few of these facts that make people uncomfortable. So there's a theory out there. The theory is that racial disparities in the United States are almost entirely due to so-called white privilege. The idea here is that America is a country that was built for the exclusive preserve of white men, and that white men have dominated it ever since, and therefore every disparity between racial groups, any statistical disparity between racial groups, can therefore be blamed on the history of the United States, and more specifically on the United States right now. Because obviously, some disparity can be blamed on the history of the United States. To pretend that discrimination hasn't existed in the United States would be foolish. Of course discrimination has. Of course discrimination against black people was rampant. I mean, there was slavery, there was Jim Crow. Of course that's true. But the question is whether white privilege right now is what is causing continued disparity between particular groups. So, let's give some facts. Okay, I'm not going to give my opinion. I'm just going to give you some facts. Criminologist Barry Glasser, in talking about crime and disparities in crime. From 1976 to 1995, blacks were identified by police as the perpetrators in more than half of all homicides. From 2000 to 2014, African Americans were murdered 8 times as often as whites per capita, nearly always as a result of black-on-black assaults. 57% of blacks in state prison were convicted of violent crimes. And other facts. The Justice Department under Bill Clinton found that blacks had a lower chance of prosecution than whites in 75 major American cities as of 1994, which would seem to contradict the viewpoint promulgated by the left that blacks are being prosecuted in outsized numbers and convicted in outsized numbers. Professor Peter Moskos of John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY found, quote, adjusted for the homicide rate, whites are 1.7 times more likely than blacks to die at the hands of police, which seems to conflict with the opinion, and it is an opinion, that the police are out there targeting black people in disproportionate numbers. A widely publicized study in July 2016 from Harvard professor Roland Fryer, who happens to be black, surveyed over 1,000 police shootings and found that black suspects are shot less often than white suspects in comparable situations. In 2015, the cops shot 987 people. A huge majority of those people were armed or threatening deadly force. Blacks represented 26% of those shots. Well, police officers are nearly 19 times more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by the police. How about the idea that black people are disproportionately in prison because of drug crimes? Well, the truth is that nobody is really disproportionately in prison because of drug crimes. The vast majority of people in jail are not there because of drug crimes. Just 16% of state offenders, state prisoners, were actually convicted of drug offenses across the United States. Most of those drug offenses involve distribution, not merely holding. So the idea that police are just willy-nilly breaking into people's apartments and then prosecuting them while they're smoking a joint is not true. Just 3.6% of state prisoners across the nation are in for civil drug possession. Most of those people pled down their original charges from distribution. Fully 71% of poor families with children are unmarried. So the idea that black people are disproportionately poor because of racism, there's not a lot to go on to suggest this. Okay, the idea that black people are disproportionately poor, or continue to be disproportionately poor, to be more specific, because of racism, the truth is intergenerational poverty can be predicted in large part by one key fact: unmarried motherhood. Okay, the poverty rate among non-married white families was 22% in 2008. The poverty rate among black married couples that same year was 7%. So what happened to all the racism? And as for the idea that all racial disparities are the product of racism, this would neglect the fact that the highest earning group in the United States of America are Asian Americans. Okay, now there's another theory that folks on the left like to tout, or an opinion folks on the left like to tout, that women are victims. Women are victimized in the United States. Women are having the roughest time of all in the United States. We need women's marches. We need to walk around wearing bizarre pink hats that represent the vagina for some unknown reason. We can't say why we're there, we can't say what we're protesting. All we know is that knit caps are awesome. Okay, so, let's go through a few facts. Number one, women are not paid 77 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man makes. That's there. And you can take their applause because you don't have to applaud facts. This is the nice thing about them. They just are, right? Christina Hoff Sommers, friend of mine, Professor, she writes, the bottom line, the 23-cent gender pay gap is simply the difference between the average earnings of all men and all women working full-time. It does not account for differences in occupations, positions, education, job tenure, or hours worked per week. When such relevant factors are considered, the wage gap narrows to the point of vanishing. Actually, young childless women often earn more than men. Here's from Time.com reporting in 2010. According to a new analysis of 2,000 communities by a market research company in 147 out of 150 of the biggest cities in the United States, the median full-time salaries of young women are 8% higher than men in their peer group. The new study suggests the gap is bigger than previously thought. Young women in New York, LA, San Diego make 17%, 12%, and 15% more than their male peers, respectively. And it even holds true in smaller areas like Raleigh-Durham and Charlotte, North Carolina, or Jacksonville, Florida. How about the idea that women are being they're victimized by a rape epidemic on college campuses? This is trotted out as a reason to march because presumably women are being raped willy-nilly at college campuses, just like this one. You walk outside and the rape truck is just going. It says free hugs on the side of it. It's just okay. The fact is that number one, as I always say, I will inject a bit of opinion. Rapists should be castrated or killed. Okay. With that said, the idea that there's a rape epidemic happening on campus is pure fantasy. This idea that 1 in 5 women is raped on campus is utterly a lie. It is not true. It is based on a survey that conflates everything from attempted forced kissing with sexual assault. So a guy goes in for a kiss, you turn your cheek. This is now the equivalent of rape, according to these polls. Professor James Allen Fox of Northeastern University and Richard Moran of Mount Holyoke College point out the estimated 19% sexual assault rate among college women is based on a survey at 2 large 4-year universities, which might not accurately reflect our nation's colleges overall. Also, the survey had a large non-response rate, with a clear possibility that those who had been victimized were more apt to have completed the questionnaire. So it wasn't even a scientific survey. Here is the real statistic. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, a violent victimization of college students report, from 1995 to 2002, there were 6 rapes per 1,000 per year. Okay, so that's a difference between 200 rapes per 1,000 per year and 6 rapes per 1,000 per year. In case you were wondering, the numbers have dropped since 2002. They've not increased since 2002. How about the idea that women in engineering, that this is all happening because of discrimination in engineering? And there may be some discrimination in engineering. There may be people who don't want a woman working in their department, but overall, it is career choice that determines where people end up in a free society. It turns out that women do not want to work in engineering as much as men want to work in engineering, and men don't want to work in nursing as much as women want to work in nursing. There are vast disparities between the sexes regarding particular populations entering a specific occupation. Right? Teachers are disproportionately women. Men are disproportionately firefighters. Is this because of sexism, or is this because it turns out that women and men like different stuff? If you don't believe that women and men like different stuff, by the way, meet a person of the opposite sex one time. Harvard psychology professor Steven Pinker, who is no right-winger, explains pretty clearly, differences between the sexes are part of the human condition. The fact that I have to say this demonstrates how stupid everything is. Hey, how about the idea that women are victimized when people like me say that they are anti-abortion? This is some imposition on them, that what I really want to do is shut down their freedom, because that's deeply what I'm concerned with. I spend my days worrying about what you do with your esophagus and also with your uterus. This is just what I do. Okay, nonsense. Okay, the reality is that people who are pro-life because they believe that life begins at conception, and the fact is that life does begin at conception. Whether you think that life is valuable enough to trump a woman's quote-unquote right to choose is another question. But there is no question that life itself begins at conception. Professor Jaime Gordon of the Mayo Clinic says, quote, by all the criteria of modern molecular biology, life is present from the moment of conception. Professor Micheline Matthews-Roth of Harvard Medical School, quote, it is incorrect to say that biological data cannot be decisive. It is scientifically correct to say that an individual life begins at conception. Okay, another opinion that's put out there, another your truth that's put out there. If you're poor in the United States, it's because you're a victim of the system. Capitalism makes people poor. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Okay, the upper middle class in the United States was 12% of Americans in 1979. Today, it is 30% of Americans. So income mobility means that people may not be in the middle class anymore because they're now in the upper middle class. As for poverty in America more generally, the poor in America are the richest poor people on the face of the earth and in human history. Pew Research points out the U.S. stands head and shoulders above the rest of the world. More than half of Americans were high income by global standards. Another 32% were upper middle income. 9 in 10 Americans were upper middle income or upper income by global economic standards. Only 7% of people in the U.S. were even middle income, and only 2% were poor. According to the American Enterprise Institute, By the way, the idea that the rich are sucking the lifeblood out of the poor, that they're not paying their fair share in taxes, American Enterprise Institute, quote, the highest income quintile is financing 96% of the entire system of transfer payments to the bottom 60% and funding the operation of the federal government. How about the idea that if you're in the top 1%, you are getting richer, but everybody else in the lower 99% is getting poorer? This makes no sense because people change in and out of the 1%. I've been in the 1%, I've not been in the 1%. At some point in the future, I will probably not be in the 1% again. Okay, as you change in life, right now, all you college students, the vast majority of you are not in the 1%. By the time that you are 10 years from now, 15 years from now, hopefully you'll have put your degrees to good use and you didn't major in poli-sci, and now you're actually going to be able to get a job and be in the 1%. Okay, as Thomas Sowell points out, by the way, income discrepancy varies largely by age. Households headed by someone 65 or older have more than 15 times as much wealth as households headed by someone under 35, because if you've been living a long time, you've been accruing wealth a long time. And as he points out, this is not because people who enter the 1% are evil. Everyone who is 65 was once 35, it turns out. Sowell also points out, a University of Michigan study showed that most of the working people who were in the bottom 20% of income earners in 1975 were also in the top 40% by some point by 1991. So if you started off at the bottom, you can move to the top in the United States. It's one of the wonderful things about the United States. How do you do it? It turns out it's not that tough. According to the Brookings Institute, you only have to do 3 things to not end up in permanent poverty in the United States. Finish high school, get a full-time job, wait to get married to have kids. That's it. You do those 3 things, you will not be in permanent poverty in the United States. And everyone is capable of these 3 things. Virtually everyone. Okay, finishing high school, let's face it, the high school system in America, that means basically you know how to read the word cat, and you have to be spotted the C and the T. You want to graduate high school in the United States. Getting a full-time job, jobs are widely available, and waiting to get married before you have children, which to me is the most inexcusable decision that people make. It just means don't put that thing there without that other thing on it and more. The Brookings Institute says, of American adults who follow these 3 simple rules, only about 2% are in poverty, nearly 75% have joined the middle class. Okay, now we get to the most controversial portion of the evening, and that is facts about transgenderism. So this, of course, is what the left is very upset about, because every time I say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and a woman can't magically become a man, and a man can't magically become a woman, and no, I will not call you a woman if you are not a woman, and no, I'm not going to describe you as she if you are not, in fact, a biological she. People on the left get very uptight. So I will reserve my opinions on all of this until the end, although you just heard them, but I will... I'm going to give you some facts now, okay? These are not disputable facts, for the most part, okay? So if you dispute the facts, you can cite the studies and you can argue with the authors of the studies. I'm going to give you facts that come not from me, but from studies and from medical literature and from reviews, and then you can argue with those. Okay, this is undisputed. There are 2 sexes. There are not 9, there are not 11, there are 2. Okay, if you have a Y chromosome, if you have a Y chromosome, then you are typically male. People without a Y chromosome are typically female. We all learned this in 5th grade biology. Variation may exist in a tiny percentage of the population. This would make you intersex. It would not necessarily make you a person of the opposite sex. Okay, transgender advocates, however, don't even care about the biology. What they claim is that no evidence must be shown of any chromosomal anomaly in order for you to claim that you're transgender. I can be a full-on XY male, a full biological male, and if I say that I am a female, you must now call me she. I'm a transgender person, and you must call me she. Right? In order to achieve this bizarre conclusion, transgender advocates have to create a new category different from sex, because obviously this is not going to work. You can't fool anybody by saying that a woman is a man, a man is a woman. So instead what you have to do is you have to create a new word, right? We'll call it gender. We'll call it gender. Gender, in their view, is about maleness or femaleness, right? These social constructs of maleness or femaleness, an entirely subjective category, not linked to biology. But separating maleness or femaleness from genetic influence is scientifically illiterate, of course. To say that a biological male is a gendered female is a basic contradiction in terms. Right? A biological male is a gendered male. He may be an effeminate male, he may be a feminine male, he is still a male. Right? And it's very easy to prove this. Okay? If a man were to experience some sort of accident that changed his hormonal balances, it would not make him a woman. Right? Whether or not he identified as a woman. If a man had an accident, and for some terrible accident, he got injured in the genitals, and suddenly he didn't have the male appendages anymore, this would not make him a woman. This would make him a man who experienced a terrible accident. A biological male may have feminine characteristics. He is still a biological male. Richard Lippa writes in the textbook, Gender, Nature, and Nurture, quote, Some researchers have argued that the word sex should be used to refer to the biological status of being male or female, whereas the word gender should be used to refer to all the socially defined, learned, constructed accoutrements of sex, such as hairstyle, dress, nonverbal mannerisms, and interests. However, it is not at all clear to what degree differences between males and females are due to biological factors versus learned and cultural factors. Okay, other facts about transgenderism that are inconvenient for transgender advocates to mention. First, the idea that transgenderism is a condition that cannot be changed and that people do not change with regard to their own views of their own biology and with regard to their views of their own sex is not true. The vast majority of children who claim to be transgender when they are children, pre-puberty, do not end up being transgender when they grow up. And according to University of Toronto professor James Cantor's studies, 2/3 of children who feel transgender outgrow their desire to transition sex by puberty. Another recent paper by endocrinologist Paul Cruz, biostatician Lawrence Meyer, psychiatrist Paul McHugh puts that number at 80%. Transgender advocates also claim that transgender suicide rates, which are extraordinarily high, which is just an incredible tragedy. By the way, when I'm saying all this, the reason I'm saying all this is because I think facts matter, not because I don't have sympathy for people who are suffering from something that really is, it must be truly terrifying, must be truly difficult to deal with. What I'm suggesting is that we need better solutions than blaming society for this problem, because the problem is not with society in large measure. The problem is largely with a mental condition. Transgender advocates claim that transgender suicide attempt rates, which run at about 40% over the lifetime, which is extraordinarily high. Suicide attempt rates in the United States, among other populations, run at about 4%. That they are a result of discrimination, which results in depression. A study from professors at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the UCLA School of Law Williams Institute found 46% of transgender men, which is women who believe they're men, and 42% of trans women, men who believe they're women, attempt suicide over the course of their lives. The study also does point out allegedly high levels of discrimination against people. And no one is in favor of discrimination against trans people. No one is in favor of treating trans people badly. I just did an interview with Blair White, who's a transgender woman, meaning a biological man who believes he's a woman. And the interview was all about whether I should use pronouns that Blair White wanted me to use, whether I should call Blair White a she. It was a very cordial interview. I explained my position and everything was fine. We can agree to disagree on these particular points. If it makes you suicidal because I say that you are your biological sex, my suggestion is that there is something deeper going on than merely what I am saying to you. By the way, the linkage between quote-unquote bullying or disagreement and suicide is not proved at all in wide varieties of population. Right? If the idea were that people who are bullied commit suicide at a higher rate, you would assume, for example, that the black suicide rate would be incredibly high because racism against blacks still exists in our culture. The black suicide rate is significantly below the white suicide rate in the United States. In fact, suicide seems to be a privilege of the wealthy. If you go to poor countries, suicide rarely exists. It's really only in rich countries in the Western Hemisphere where you see high suicide rates. Okay, how about the idea that discrimination, though, is causing the suicide? Well, the same study from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the UCLA School of Law investigated people's suicide rates if they were identified. If they were identified as a member of the opposite sex or a member of the sex to which they claimed membership. Okay, so the suicidality rate among transgender women who say people identify them as transgender regularly is about 45%, according to this study. But the suicidality rate among transgender women who say they are occasionally or never identified by others as transgender is 40%. Right, so in other words, a man who believes he's a woman goes through all the surgeries, has all the hormone treatments, and no one can even identify this person as a woman, still has a suicide attempt rate of 40%. And the suicidality rate among female to male transgenders is identical, whether or not people can identify them as transgenders. The evidence that transgender surgery, by the way, mitigates suicide risk is mixed. It is mixed. There are studies that say yes, there are studies that say no. A 2004 review of more than 100 international studies by the University of Birmingham found, quote, no robust scientific evidence that gender reassignment surgery is clinically effective. A cohort study from Sweden, released in 2011, covering sex reassignment surgeries from 1973 to 2003, found that transgender surgery recipients were still 19 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population, and stated that, quote, sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism. So, everything that I just said, these are all facts. You can argue with the studies, you can argue that the statistics are not right, but you actually have to argue with why those are wrong. You can't just say that my opinion is wrong because my facts are wrong. You need to argue that the facts are wrong themselves. Okay, you actually have to argue with the facts. Now, here are my opinions. You may have gotten hints of them throughout the speech, but here are my clear opinions based on this. You can even argue, it's fair for you to argue with the conclusions I'm drawing. You can say that the premises I'm laying out do not lay to these conclusions. You may say that the facts that I'm laying out aren't sufficient to reach these conclusions, and then you have to explain why. What you don't get to do is say, I don't like your opinion, therefore I will ignore all of your facts, right? My truth is more important than the facts that you cite. Here are my conclusions. When it comes to racial disparities, race does not cause crime, obviously. Right? Culture causes crime, which is why poverty tends to correlate very highly with crime, regardless of population, but is not the same among all population groups. Right? Disparities in arrests by race are not evidence of racism. If you want to stop the criminal disparity rate, all you have to do is something simple. Stop as individuals committing crimes. Okay, this is the best way to fight disparities in the crime rate. The police only respond to calls that a crime has occurred. Okay, that means that if you stop committing crimes, you're going to be arrested less often. Continuing and widening disparities in racial wealth are connected to decision making. Okay, it is true that when it comes to history, okay, that black people in the United States, because of all the discrimination, start off at a lower point wealth-wise than white people in the United States. Of course, that's true. But it is also important to note that there are groups that have come to the United States with nothing and are in the top income earners in the United States. Right? The fact is that, as I mentioned, the highest income earning group in the United States are Asian Americans. When my great-grandparents came to the United States in 1907, they literally had nothing and didn't speak English. And now my parents did well, my grandparents did well, and I'm doing well. Right? The idea is not, does history leave people differently off? Because that's always been true. Right? There are always different populations that are worse off or better off under any regime historically. The question is, what do we do right now to make your life better? And sitting around and saying that history has made things bad for me does not solve anyone's problems. You have to identify the problem right now. It needs to be solved. If you're not identifying the problem that needs to be solved and suggesting solutions for those problems, you are part of the problem. Because now you are saying to people there are obstacles that you as an individual cannot overcome. Okay. How about female victimhood? So here's my opinion on female victimhood. Women are not victims in the United States. This is an asinine contention. Women in the United States are the best off women in the history of mankind, and it is not close. Victimizing women. We are with you. My problem with the Me Too movement is not that they are calling out bad men doing bad things. More of this. Name them. Okay, I want to stand alongside you and say that these men should go to jail. And I'm as clean on this score as anyone in American public life. I was a virgin until marriage. Okay, I do not hang out with women who are not my wife. I'm of the Mike Pence mindset when it comes to this stuff. Okay, the fact is that I want to see men who mistreat women. I was brought up like this. I have 3 younger sisters. Men who mistreat women are the worst people on planet Earth, and they should pay the worst penalties on planet Earth. But it doesn't help anybody when you conflate systems of people who are oppressive with people who you just don't like. Right? When you come at me and say that Aziz Ansari is a sexual abuser or a sexual assaulter because you went on a date with him, performed oral sex on him, and got naked in his apartment twice, and then you say, oh, he took it the wrong way, and the next morning you say, oh, well, I didn't feel good about that. I'm not going to treat you the same as the lady who was raped by Harvey Weinstein. Sorry. Right? This is not oppression of women. This is called having a rational standard for behavior. As far as the argument that women are victimized by people like me who say that women should bear the children they conceive, the answer is because I think the child has value, not because I'm trying to oppress you. I don't care what you do with your body at any other time. I do care what happens to the child that is inside your body. And it would not matter whether that child was outside your body or inside your body. I don't think that you should kill babies. On income, here is my conclusion from the facts that I have cited. You are not tied to your class in America. You can rise, you can fall. Your power is in your hands. No one is standing in your way. If someone is standing in your way, you need to name the person. If there's a policy standing in your way, you need to name the policy. Don't just say that society is barring you from succeeding, particularly not if you're going to a good university like UConn. Don't tell me that people in America are standing in your way and telling you you can't succeed. No one gives a damn about you. No one cares if you succeed or not. And that means also, the bad news is no one cares about you. The good news is that because no one cares about you, no one cares about stopping you. No one cares. So go out and do your best and make something of yourself. You're not a victim. And then finally, on transgenderism. Great sympathy for everyone who's suffering from this. It does no good for a society to lie about sex in order to supposedly make people feel better. Lies are not a path to virtue, nor a path to sanity. Truth is a path to both of these things. This does not mean you can't treat people with cordiality. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have manners. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be kind to people. It does mean that it is an imposition on me to ask me to lie about the nature of basic biological facts because it is going to offend you. And my friend Jordan Peterson did a great interview in Britain the other day in which Jordan specifically was asked about this. This woman asked him, why does your right to free speech trump my right to be offended? And he said, because if it doesn't, there is no right to free speech. And because people are saying things that offend each other all the time. This is how we get to truth. Right? Here's my other opinion on this. Pronouns have always applied to biological categories, not subjective states of mind, or even outward appearance. The idea, by the way, that pronouns should be applied simply to outward appearance would make every Bugs Bunny cartoon ever really ridiculous, right? Every time Bugs jumps into the dress to try and seduce Elmer Fudd to get him to leave him alone, you'd have to call Bugs a female bunny. That's not how this works. To claim something that is objectively untrue as reality is not fact-based thinking. To insist that you are a man and to insist that a falsehood is a fact is delusional. If you are a man, you're a biological man, you claim that you are in fact a woman, this is not true. Okay, it's just not true. You may feel like a woman. I don't know how that would even operate, considering that if you're a man, I don't know how you would feel like a woman. It's like saying that I, as a man, could feel like something completely different. I feel like a chicken. Like, I can't feel like a woman. I'm not a woman, right? I can feel like maybe I don't belong in my body, but it seems like you're jumping to an identity that you've never actually occupied. But this delusion corresponds to significant levels of depression and suffering, which is why I have said that gender identity disorder is a mental illness and should be treated as such, rather than being foisted off on society as some sort of flaw in society that we could all fix if we just started using preferred pronouns. There's not enough evidence to support that position by any stretch of the imagination. Now listen, as I say, you can argue with any of these conclusions, but you will have to explain why the facts that I cite are either incorrect or why they do not lead to the conclusions that I have stated. Some people, however, are so deeply offended that they feel no need to offer an argument. Instead, they just claim offense. They claim that they're victims, and now they win the argument. You don't need to play this game, because it is a game, and it's a stupid game. They claim I'm just being offensive, or I've microaggressed them, or I'm invading their safe space. Okay, facts are not microaggressions. Facts are facts. No space should be free from facts or safe from facts. Those who insist that I respect their truth, they don't have any truth. They have opinions. Those opinions often oppose truth. I am far more justified in ignoring opinions unsupported by facts than they are in dismissing facts that support my opinion. Okay, we can't have a conversation without a common basis in fact. If those facts offend people, so be it. I can live with that. Facts don't care about your feelings. Thanks so much. Anyone who disagrees, raise your hand. You get to go to the front of the line. I always like to talk with people who disagree. So let's do that. Which side is the microphone on? It's over here. So are you walking around or are people lining up?
We're going to have people come around the back and form a single file line against the wall. And keep the questions brief and no follow-up questions.
Hi Ben, nice to meet you. I'm Peter.
Nice to meet you.
So I go to high school right over at E.O. Smith, and a lot of my friends liberal. It's a pretty liberal atmosphere. They're kind of talking about like Germany being better in economic growth, being better with controlling inflation, things like that, and how we should emulate them, do something like the EU. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
I mean, the EU is failing, so that's economically illiterate. The fact is the United States is by far the world's powerhouse economy. It will continue for the foreseeable future to be the world's powerhouse economy. It drives the entire economy of Europe, too. We paid their defense bills for something like 50 years, so that helps as well. Germany had to, they took austerity measures like 4 years ago. They had to cut back on their social programs. Angela Merkel got in hot water with her own party and with a lot of voters specifically because of this. So the idea that Germany has a stronger economy than the United States, there's always somebody who's saying somebody else has a stronger economy than the United States. Like 5 years ago, people were saying China has a stronger economy. 20 years ago, people were saying Japan has a stronger economy. The answer is no, no, and no. The United States has far and away the strongest economy in the history of the world.
Hello, Ben. My name is Martin.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm not really a fan, but I like
Thank you for
hearing you
showing
talk.
up. Thank you for showing up specifically because you're not a fan.
Right, I
Thank
like
you.
hearing you talk. So one of my questions is, you talk about this culture between black and black violence. What is your solution then to that?
Don't commit crime. I mean,
I feel like there's a bigger issue.
I mean, my broader solution really is that these communities require more police, not less. There's a woman named Jane Levy who writes for the LA Times. She's actually on the left. And she wrote an entire book about how a lot of the disparities in crime, particularly in black communities, were due to racism, but not in the way that we think of racism like white cops going in and beating people up in black neighborhoods, but because white people basically said to black neighborhoods, take care of yourself. Right? If there's high violence in your areas, then you take care of it yourself. That leads to higher tribal levels of violence in any society, right? Whenever there's not an enforcement mechanism in place to actually stop crime, then the crime rates go up. And in fact, you know, the broken windows theory in New York City has saved an enormous number of black lives because the police were actually present and active. You need more active, present police hunting down people who kill other people. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that you actually need fathers to stick around. This is true in white communities and black communities. One of the great tragedies of the last 4 decades in the United States is that the single motherhood rate has risen not just in the black community from 20% in 1960 to over 70% now, but in 5% in the white community to over 40% now. That's a huge jump in both communities. Young men particularly do need a male influence there to curb them. As a man who was once young, I can attest to this. So I think that that's another aspect. And obviously, once you actually lower the crime rate, then you're going to get more economic growth. This is what's happened in particular areas of New York, where once the police were actually able to go in and shut down crime in particular areas, then suddenly businesses would come back in. They weren't afraid of being robbed. And suddenly people were willing to live in those areas who weren't willing to live before. This is gentrification, and gentrification is a good thing. Right? The left has opposed gentrification by suggesting that, oh, it's people throwing people out of their historic homes and all this nonsense. The fact is that if the quality of life in an area gets better, not worse, that seems to me an undeniable good. Right? So if the area gets better, that's gentrification. If the area stays crappy, it's ghettoization. I mean, there has to be some solution. You can't just claim that when things get better, that's racism. When things get worse, that's racism also. Right? So the reason that New York City has gotten better is because of increased policing. So increased policing, a cultural focus on fathers staying in the home, and mothers not bearing children out of wedlock, and an individual commitment not to commit crimes.
So just following up real quick after that, so would you say the solution then is to improve education in that sense, teaching these people early on to stop doing these things?
I mean, I honestly don't think that the quality of the educational system is heavily connected to crime. Just because I don't think that schools are the folks who teach people not to kill each other. I think that's usually their parents. So I think that the quality of schools is more a reflection of the poverty of neighborhoods than it is the cause of crime rates in neighborhoods. I think it's more of an effect than a cause in other words. Okay, thanks so much.
Just had 2 quick questions for you. 1, how do you think it will play out if Oprah actually runs for president? And 2, can I grab a selfie with you?
So I'll have to ask security about the selfie since I'm not in control of my own fate anymore, unfortunately. But as far as the Oprah running for president question, I don't think it's going to work out the way she wants it to. So there's a poll yesterday that came out, Trump versus various Democrats. Against Joe Biden, I think it was 57-40. Against Bernie Sanders, it was like 55-40 in favor of the Democrats. And then against Oprah, it was 51-42. So she was polling worse than Biden and Sanders. The reason that I think that she'd be in trouble is because, number one, I do think she'd win the primaries, because I think it'd be very hard to defeat her in a primary. But I think that in a general election, here's the thing about Trump. Trump is basically made of mud. What I mean by this is that if you're a politician, the worst thing that can happen to you is someone throws mud on your skirt, right? Suddenly you were pristine, and then someone throws mud at you, and you're dirty. Trump is a mud monster. You cannot hit him with anything. Right? I mean, you literally nothing. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, we found out that he probably paid a porn star $130,000 not to talk about an affair that he had with her when he was married to Melania and his son had been born 4 months ago, and no one cared. Okay, that right there is the sign of a candidate that you can do nothing about, right? What that means is that Trump is never going to be a 60% guy, but he can be a 45% guy because he's already gotten 45, 46%, and that means that he can duplicate his performance of last time and nothing you say about him can drag him down. Oprah is almost the opposite. So Oprah starts off at 51%, but that's because everybody thinks of Oprah as kind and wonderful, and everybody loves Oprah, yeah. And then it'll turn out that people will start digging into the school that she ran in South Africa for years, and that had 2 separate, pretty brutal sex scandals against children. Or they'll start digging into all of the weird health conspiracy nuttiness that she's done on her show. And the minute that people start actually tossing mud at her, because she's considered angelic, that mud shows up on the white skirt a lot better than it would show up on Trump. So I think that she would be a lot weaker a stronger candidate in the primaries than people think, a weaker candidate in the general than people think.
Mr. Shapiro, it's a pleasure. Big fan. My question has to do a little bit with Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
The recent hysteria with Canada's Bill C-16
Yes.
with the compelled speech law, right? I just want to know, do you think that there's anything to worry about in America as far as compelled speech goes, government overreach?
Yes. And so I think that anti-discrimination laws are going to be used as an excuse to crack down on religious institutions and people who disagree. So the way this will happen, because that's what Bill C-16 is, it's an anti-discrimination law. The idea is that you are discriminating against people if you do not use the proper pronoun. Right? This already exists, by the way, I believe in New York City. The New York City Human Rights Commission passed an ordinance that will fine restaurants like $250,000 if they do not address a patron by the pronoun that person wishes to be addressed by. I don't know how that stands up to the First Amendment, I really don't, but that also requires a Supreme Court that's willing to implement the First Amendment, and so that depends a lot on whether Justice Kennedy has had his bowel movement that day. It's impossible to predict whether Justice Kennedy is going to go one way or another on any particular issue. I do see this happening in California. There was already an attempt to strip the Boy Scouts of their 501c3 status in the state of California because the Boy Scouts weren't allowing gay scoutmasters. You can certainly see something very similar happening if they refuse to address people by particular pronouns, or if a church or synagogue refuses to perform a same-sex wedding. They can say, okay, well, you have a nonprofit status, but you're violating our view of what should happen with regard to marriage. The state now recognizes marriages between men and women and women. So we're going to remove that status from you. I think that we're moving pretty quickly in that direction. That's where the left clearly wants to go. The only question is whether the constitutional barriers will be strong enough to prevent it.
Do you think they are?
Again, I think that it depends. I think it's up to us. I don't rely on the Supreme Court to protect the Constitution because it historically has done a pretty poor job of it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shapiro, for being here. It's truly amazing that you were able to come. My name is Justin, and I have one question for myself and one for my brother, who unfortunately couldn't be here. He asks, what actual actions that Trump has taken do you like and think are beneficial?
So there are a bunch of them. So I've actually been asked to grade Trump on policy before. And I say is that on executive policy, I give him an A-. On legislative policy, I give him a C. It would have been a D except for the tax bill. And on rhetoric, I give him an F. Because, I mean, I like complete sentences. But when it comes to his policy, I mean, Justice Gorsuch is great. The cuts in regulation are great. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem is great. The tax bill is really good. The attempts to take land out of the hands of the federal government and open it up to development is a very good thing. Half of the land in the West is owned by the federal government, run by the federal government. The new religious freedom regulations that he's promulgating in HHS, all of these things are very good things. So I think that on policy, he has been quite good, at least as far as he can do it with a Congress that's so fractious. Again, on rhetoric, I think where he's done the most damage. And I will say this, in evaluating Trump, I don't just evaluate him on policy. So I think a lot of conservatives want to say, his policy's good, so aren't you happy? And the answer is, I'm happy with his policy. Right? But being the president is about more than policy. It's also about, can you help build the social fabric? Can you make America a place that is more unified, not less unified? Can you make the country a better place to live because people don't hate their neighbors? And on that score, I don't think that the president's done a very good job at all. I think on the score of policies that I like, he's done great.
And my question is, I don't want to say you're wrong in doing this, but why do you feel it's necessary to react so sharply to leftists and the views that they hold, and react so sharply to to beliefs that they hold about opinions that are...
Well, I mean, I think that it depends on the context. So when it comes to speaking with forceful language about the policies of the left in broad strokes, I think it's important to point out where I think not only they're wrong, but they're misguided. And in some cases, the views of the left I think are patently morally evil. Actually, when it comes to the idea that, for example, you have a right to my labor, I think that's an evil statement. So I feel very strongly about that. You can disagree with the feeling, you can disagree with my opinion, that's fine. When it comes to dealing with people who disagree with me, I'm actually, I think, pretty cordial, as you saw from the first question. So it depends on how people address me. If I'm addressed and people want to have a nice discussion, I've done this all my life. I love doing that, I prefer it. But if somebody is going to throw brickbats, then I am going to respond in kind. So you get to choose you get to choose the weapon for the actual face-off.
Thanks for coming, especially after the reputation we developed last year.
So, my name's Ian. I don't necessarily agree with you and everything, but that's why I came here. I'd rather be here than my own echo chamber.
Well, thank you.
So you said that you consider transgenderism a mental disorder, which is something that I don't know enough about to properly debate you on and criticize. So more broadly, that then brings me to ask, do you think that the United States should do more to develop proper infrastructure to take care of people generally who suffer from various mental illnesses, or are we doing a fine job?
No, so the answer is yes. I think that the typical route of taking care of people who can't take care of themselves more broadly. And I don't believe, by the way, that every form of mental illness requires an entire system of infrastructure, right? I don't think that a transgender person is suffering the same type of mental disorder as somebody who has severe bipolar disorder, for example. And my grandfather on my father's side, my dad's dad, suffered from either manic depression or actual schizophrenia and had to be institutionalized for a while. That's a different thing than transgenderism, for example. So the treatments are not the same for every mental disorder, of course. But the idea that people who can't take care of themselves need some sort of net is well established in sort of American public life. But I would suggest that the place that you start is the place that everyone starts when they need help. You start with the family. If the family can't help, then you go to the community. And I mean generally the religious and social community. If that can't help, you go to local government. If that can't help, state government. If that can't help, federal government. One of the great tragedies of our mental illness system is that it's been federalized. So it used to be that local and state communities were largely responsible for funding mental health facilities. In the 1960s, JFK, because he had a sister who was mentally ill, thought that the federal government could do a better job, and he actually imposed from above a federal system in terms of mental illness and how to take care of people who are mentally ill. That actually removed responsibility from states. States just threw the burden onto the federal government. It's made facilities worse. In the 1970s, there was a vast release of people who were mentally ill and probably shouldn't be on the streets onto the streets. That led to a significant uptick, for example, in homelessness. A huge percentage of people who are homeless across the nation are people with severe mental illness who need to be on drugs. And are not being given their drugs and are being told that it's an aspect of freedom to live on the streets and live in misery. I don't think that's right at all. So that's my short answer as to what we need to do with people who can't take care of themselves.
Hey guys, my name is Carmi, huge fan. I'm originally from LA too. Moved in 2012.
Why would you move to this weather, dude?
Well, my dad's a rabbi, so he moved.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
So do you think the GOP rigs election with gerrymandering and voter ID laws? And specifically with Roy Moore, the Roy Moore election, 97% of black people voted for Doug Jones. People say that they saved the election.
Well, I mean, so as far as voter ID, I do not think that voter ID is discriminatory. If I have to show an ID to buy an alcohol, it seems to me that I should have to show ID in order to vote. This does not seem like a huge burden on me. I mean, voting seems to me a significantly more important decision than what type of beer I get or whether I have to buy a crappy Zima. As far as gerrymandering, the truth is that gerrymandering, there are only two ways to do districting. Right? Way one is that you have some sort of quasi-impartial board that actually draws the districts. The problem is these boards are rarely impartial, and historically those boards have been biased to one side or another. And so gerrymandering has been the way that we've done politics in the United States for 300 years at this point, or at least 250 years. So the idea that that is something out of bounds or crazy is sort of ridiculous, especially because the argument seems to be that once Republicans enter power, then they can gerrymander the districts, so Democrats never get elected again. Literally 2 years ago, the Democrats had the presidency, and in 2009, right, I'm enough to remember this, in 2009 the Democrats ran everything, and Republicans were never going to win again. And then Republicans won the House and they won the Senate. Now it probably looks like Republicans may lose the House, despite the gerrymandering. And then, you know, it'll happen, the Democrats will gerrymander it right back, right? This is what happens in state legislatures all around the country. So the idea that it's some sort of grave thing that we have to be deeply concerned about, I don't see the evidence that it's super grave. I'm open to the idea that there's a better solution than gerrymandering. I'm just not sure that the solutions that have been proposed, these sort of bipartisan boards, that those are necessarily the proper solutions.
Thank you very much. And may I also take a selfie with you, possibly?
Oh, well, I don't think the other guy got to, so that's kind of unfair. But we'll see if afterward we can do some selfies.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for coming. A common criticism liberals, particularly progressives, often levy at conservatives is the absence of compassion, so to speak, in the formation of our policies, especially under Trump. So what is your position on if compassion over logic, perhaps, or
empathy is
whatever
stupid.
balance?
So, I mean, not supposed to find a point on empathy is dumb. The reason I say this is not because I don't have empathy for people. It's because you should not make policy based on who you care most about. If I did, I would take all of your money and give it to my kids. I like them better than I like you. Right? The fact is that, I mean, there's an entire book on empathy that's specifically about why empathy in policy is a problem. Sympathy is fine. Right? Having sympathy for people is good. Having empathy for people is not great. The distinction being, if you have sympathy, you feel bad for someone. If you have empathy, you put yourself in the shoes of that person. But by doing so, you are now not in the shoes of everybody else. The best policy that can be made is the policy that is about the data and the number of people who are affected, because you can always find the person who's the most victimized and then make policy around that person, as opposed to trying to create policy that affects the most people in the most beneficial way. So, I mean, it's great to be empathetic. I don't see empathy as much as of a moral value as some other people do. I don't think feelings are in and of themselves moral values. I think behavior is moral much more than feelings. Maybe this is my Judaic background, but Judaism is much more an acts-based religion than a grace-based religion, meaning that in my religious viewpoint, I think that God cares much more about what you do than how you feel about it. I think politically speaking, some of the worst things that have ever happened were based on good intentions. And so, trying to formulate policy that is best without violating people's rights is a better way of doing policy than saying, I empathize with this group of people or this particular person, and therefore I'm going to shift policy to meet them there.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. My name is Josh. It's a pleasure to meet you. So, political polarization in America is an increasing problem as the years go by. My questions kind of tie into each other. The first one is, what do you believe is the root cause of this problem? And the second is, how would you go about fixing it?
Great question. So, I'm excited about this because I'm writing an entire book on it right now. So, I think that the root cause of the political divisions in American society and Western civilization more broadly is that there is a telos-shaped hole in our heart that is now being filled with tribalism. So that's a very complicated way of saying that telos means purpose for those who are not philosophy students. In the Aristotelian and Platonic view, the way that you derive your value as a human being is by acting in accordance with nature's law, essentially. That if you look at the universe, what you see is that man is a creature of reason. If you act in accordance with that reason, then you are acting in accordance with your purpose. And there's a whole set of virtues that you have to cultivate in order to act best in accordance with your identity as a reasoned person. And Aristotle recommends these. Judeo-Christian values seem to mirror these pretty strongly, which is why for basically the entire medieval scholastic period, there was a great identity between Aristotelian thought and Judeo-Christian values. And that carried forward all the way through most of the Enlightenment, actually, despite some pushback to the contrary. The American founding was based on this essential idea that every right has a corresponding duty, that you have a purpose in the universe that is laid forth on a religious level by your religious community, by the Bible, and on a reasonable level by a universe that requires certain things if you're under natural law, right? This is what the founders talked about when they talked about natural law. I think all of that's been lost. I think it's been systematically undermined by 200 years of philosophy that says that God does not exist, the Bible is a fraud, that you cannot get to ought from is, right? The David Hume distinction that just because the universe is a certain way doesn't mean that's how you ought to be. And once you do that, and you say to everybody, make your own purpose, it turns out people are not good at making their own purpose. When people try to make their own purpose, they end up usually at hedonism, or at self-interest, or at the triumph of the will, or at the idea that if we shape together as a community, then we can create utopia together. And you've seen all of those things happen in the 20th century. I think now the most common area in which people are finding fulfillment is tribalism. Because our sense of community has broken down so much because religious communities have declined, people don't see each other as neighbors or friends anymore. We look at the United States and we don't see a set of common principles that we all hold to. I mean, this is a perfect example tonight. We need probably dozens of security members just to talk. We don't have the same set of values anymore. Because of that, people are filling that hole with tribalism. They're filling that hole with, okay, there's a bunch of people who look like me, and therefore, those are my people, and I'll stand up for their interests. And you see this, I think, to a certain extent in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think you certainly see it in the alt-right movement. And all of these tribal movements are deeply disturbing and cut against the grain of Western thought, which has been moving toward individuality and universalism simultaneously for the past several thousand years, and is now moving, I think, in a completely sideways direction, thanks to the undermining of these key concepts. Purpose, individual purpose, the capacity of individuals to take control of their lives, communal purpose, and the capacity of the community to set boundaries around individual behavior, so far it doesn't hurt other people, and also to ensure people's freedom.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder, we want to have people who disagree with Ben. You guys can come skip the line.
Yeah, just raise your hand.
Hi.
No cheating.
Yeah, I disagree with you.
Perfect.
I was wondering, I personally, I'm a progressive, and I was just wondering with our current political atmosphere right now, why is it that we have strayed away from, not just right or left, or just general people in politics, stray away from facts and try to twist around the truth. For example, like at Fox, MSNBC, all these big corporate news programs, they tend to have an agenda. Why is it that it's so hard to get facts out to people?
I mean, I think it's always been hard to get facts out to people is the truth. I think the narrative has always been more prominent in our mind. What we want to believe, I mean, confirmation bias is obviously a very prevalent thing. What you want to believe, you tend to believe, and you tend to look for excuses to believe it. I think that in the era of mass media, where every taste can be catered to, you see that a lot more often, obviously. And so if you think like Rachel Maddow, you're likely to watch Rachel Maddow. If you think like Sean Hannity, you're likely to watch Sean Hannity and have all your biases confirmed. It's one of the reasons why I hope that I'm at least attempting to present facts, even some facts that disagree with my position, and then explain why those are wrong. And if you present a fact to me that disagrees with my position, I'll acknowledge the fact. I'll either say that it strays from my framework or not. I mean, it's something that I strive to do. Maybe I fail, but it's something I'm trying to do. I think that the reason that people have strayed away from fact and moved into subjectivity is because there's something comforting about subjectivity. You can never be wrong. The thing about facts is that somebody can prove you wrong. It's uncomfortable to be out there on the limb all the time waiting for somebody to saw it off behind you. Right? Doing what I do, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I love what I do for a living. But I will also say that there's a constant feeling of, am I right? And when somebody says you're wrong, if you're a good person, you think, well, maybe I am wrong. Let me examine that more. And it's uncomfortable to feel like you're wrong. Every time you feel like you're wrong, it means that you have to examine your presuppositions and think about whether you're saying the right things. And so I take criticism seriously, or at least I try to. And I think that's a hard thing to do, and especially in an era where we have been told that there's a virtue to being offended, that you being offended is a substitute for you learning something, that if you don't like what I'm saying, then you being offended is enough for you to just dismiss it out of hand. You don't have to go home and do any research. That's made things very convenient for people, particularly everybody's into virtue signaling now. It's very easy. This is why you see these kind of tsunamis that start, where people will call Steven Pinker a racist. Right? I mean, Steven Pinker is a lefty. Steven Pinker only says that there are differences in biology between men and women, for example. Or he'll say things like I've said, that there are different crime rates in particular communities. And then he'll get blasted for this as supposedly upholding alt-right views. That's because people want to believe that those facts are not right, and so they will blame his motivation and then attribute to him a motivation that he doesn't like. So if we can refrain from questioning each other's motivation and go to maybe where we go wrong in logic, then maybe we can have a conversation. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why, even though I'm an Orthodox Jew, I never cite the Bible in defense of my position, because I know that a lot of people don't believe in the Bible, so we can't have a conversation on common ground here.
Thank you.
Good evening, Ben. My name is Quinn. My question stems from attending Turning Point USA Student Action Summit in West Palm Beach just a few weeks ago. Seeing you speak and seeing how attendees were excited about the United States moving the embassy to Jerusalem. While I do believe that the land rightfully belongs to the Jews, I do not think the moral obligation is sufficient reasoning to intervene in this conflict. As libertarians, non-interventionism is a key tenet of the philosophy. Why should we continue funding anything in the Middle East, even Israel, given our track record? And why is intervention on Judeo-Christian moral grounds permissible, although we have a separation of church and state?
Okay, so it's not intervention on the basis of Judeo-Christian morality per se. Meaning, if it were just on the basis of Judeo-Christian morality, then we would not be giving aid to any of the other countries in the Middle East, for example. We give aid to Saudi Arabia, we give aid to Egypt, we give aid to Jordan, we give aid to the Palestinians, some $300 to $400 million a year. By the way, I'd be much happier if we just cut off all aid. I mean, I think there's a strong case to be made, the Rand Paul case, that you just don't give foreign aid, period. But if you do give foreign aid, then the idea is that it's supposed to be in our national interest. Then the question becomes, is it in our national interest to be involved in the Middle East? And this is a question I think that was decided relatively conclusively on September 11th. I mean, the idea that we can sort of retreat from the world and that we can just intervene in sort of policing actions, as the Clinton administration did, came home on 9/11, and 3,000 Americans died because of that. So the idea that a powerful America in the world is unnecessary, that we can retract within our own borders and that there won't be some enemy that comes and fills the space. By the way, that does have impact on commerce, that does have impact on our economics, it does have impact on how people live. Now, my view is sort of the view of the Founding Fathers, which is that we ought not be entangled in permanent alliances. We should always be looking to what is in our interest. But one of the things that defines our interest is the fact that we are a good country, right? We are great because we are good is the idea that if we were to be a completely amoral country, then we would not be worth standing for, right? We should be, to the best of our ability, balancing moral obligations that we have as the leader of the world, in which capacity we've liberated Europe twice, and in which capacity we've liberated the people of the Soviet Union, and in which capacity we have liberated the people of South Korea. So all of those things are great goods. I think it's one of the reasons why the United States is the beacon of the world and why it's something worth defending, not just on power grounds. So, but on a realism level, if we don't make more allies, then we have more enemies. If we don't back our allies, then those allies are likely to suffer catastrophic defeat. If we don't side with the countries that side with us, then we are likely to see those countries side with somebody else, and that puts us in a negative international position with regard to issues that a lot of libertarians do care more about than defense, things like trade, economics, and even culture.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Connor. I was just wondering, I agree with you that like biologically a man is a man and a woman is a woman. I was just wondering what you see the detriment of society, like why we can't like let a transgender like woman be called she or something.
Because it's a lie.
I agree.
Society. So I think there are a couple of reasons. So yeah, sorry, you let me finish the question.
No, I'm just wondering, well, what do you see? I understand it's lying. Like I was taught not to lie. I just don't understand what is so wrong about that specific lie.
Well, I mean, as opposed to other lies, I'm not sure there is anything wrong. I mean, I don't like all of them, but as far as that specific lie, I think that one of the problems that we have is this determination that men can become women and women can become men undermines some barriers between men and women that I think are useful and good, particularly in children. So if I have to teach my 3.5-year-old, or she's almost 4, if I teach my almost 4-year-old girl that she can become a boy, then I think that is not only lying to her, I think it's confusing her, and I think it's damaging to her psyche. One of the premises of the transgender movement is that human minds are completely non-malleable. That oddly enough, men are not men and women are not women, but if you are transgender, that is unchangeable, and that especially among children, if a 3 or 4-year-old has certain feelings, those feelings have to be taken completely seriously. We can't fight against them. We can't suggest that the kid will grow out of it. Instead, we have to say, this kid is inherently transgender. I can tell you, having kids are incredibly malleable. Kids are easily confused. And saying to a child, which is what the transgender movement would like to do, I mean, they're having drag shows in kindergarten now in some areas. When you do that, when you confuse kids about gender, you're doing the kids no favors. You're doing them significant, or you could be doing significant damage to kids. Kids should not be confused about their biology. Kids should not be confused about their gender. And let's put it this way, just from a certain statistical standpoint, if it is true that the transgender suicide attempt rate is 40% over the lifetime, and if I am right, then more kids will be confused about gender, which, by the way, you do see. You've seen an uptick in transgender surgery in Europe. You've seen a greater identification as transgender overall in places like Europe, malleable rates of transgenderism in Europe. If that's the case, then you're raising the suicide rates, presumably, if there's an association between, for young people who are now confused about gender. So I'm not in the mood for countenancing lies about what men and women are, specifically when I think that there is a goal of redefining a key term for the entire society.
That's fair. I just wondered.
Yeah.
That's fine, yeah.
Hi, so my question is actually about your opinion on healthcare. I know that you believe that privatization of healthcare is the most effective means to solve the problems that we have. Yet besides thought experiments, I really haven't seen any evidence for that. For me, when you look at the facts, look at more socialized programs such as Canada, they spend 10% of their GDP on healthcare, and yet their life expectancy is in the low to mid 80s. You look at the UK, and they spend 8.8% of their GDP on it, and the life expectancy is also in the 80s. But then you look at the United States, we have a more privatized system. We spend 15.4% of our GDP on it, and yet our life expectancy is lower. So my question is, why do you, my question is basically, if you look at all that, what it tells me is socialization of healthcare covers more people, makes life expectancy longer, and it's just more effective all around. So do you have any evidence or examples where privatization has actually increased healthcare?
Okay, so the truth is that we haven't actually seen a move from a socialized medicine system to a privatized system, so it would be hard to find an example where moving from one of those examples to a privatized system works. And we haven't really seen even a system where we move from privatization to universal health care in the sense that the system has never been deregulated. I mean, my basic premise is that what we have now is almost the worst system. We have a mixed system, which has driven up costs because of subsidizations from Medicare and Medicaid, and has also driven up costs because of regulation, and then it's still privatized, so doctors are still charging a lot of money. The best example that I can use is a small scale example because it doesn't exist in large scale. By the way, we can talk about problems in socialized medicine systems. We can talk about the fact that there is rationing of healthcare that does occur in places like Canada and Britain in a way it doesn't with regard to surgery, particularly in the United States. We can talk about cancer survival rates in the United States, which are better than cancer survival rates in socialized medicine countries. We can talk about the fact that it's not, you really shouldn't statistically compare life expectancy between Canada and Britain and the United States because the populations are incredibly different. Just in terms of ethnic diversity, the ethnic diversity in the United States is very different from the ethnic diversity of Canada, right? Canada is nearly homogenous. The ethnic diversity in the United States is very different, and different ethnic groups do have different health problems. For example, heart disease is more prevalent in black men than it is in white men. That's just a fact. That has nothing to do with moral culpability or anything. It's a reality that is taught in medical school. It's the way they profile patients. So you'd have to find a comparable population to start. Then you'd have to actually model it out. But the best example that I can think of is, well, sorry, let me backtrack for 1 second before I get to the example. The theory is that the shortages in healthcare are largely driven by lack of supply, not rationing of supply. So there aren't enough doctors is the problem. If you had more doctors and open competition, it would drive price down. Now, the best example of this is in laser eye surgery. So laser eye surgery in the United States is almost entirely deregulated. It's not covered by insurance for most people. It's considered an elective surgery. And that means that doctors actually have to compete on the open market. One of the big problems in our healthcare system is if you walk into the doctor's office and you say, I want an x-ray, how much will it cost me? The doctor literally will not tell you. The doctor literally can't tell you because they have to run through the insurance company, they have to bargain with the insurance company, that they may be covered by this insurance company, but that insurance company. In a socialized medicine system, they just say zero. Well, that leads to an increased demand because there is an elasticity in healthcare demand, and that leads, in essence, to shortages in healthcare supply. Overall, that means that people may live longer because people can access healthcare whenever they want, supposedly. But it also means that when it comes to elective surgeries, or when it comes to surgeries that can be delayed, those are delayed very often, and that's something you see from the National Health Service. When it comes to completely privatized systems, if there were complete transparency in price, then you would see an actual supply-demand curve. This is what you see in laser eye surgery, which used to cost $20,000 an eye, $10,000 an eye. Now it costs like $2,000 an eye because every single doctor went into ophthalmology or optometry. All of them. Right? There are 4 different fields in medicine. My wife's a doctor, as everyone knows, I've said 1,000 times. So that means that virtually everyone in her class went into what they call the ROAD system, right? Radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, dermatology, mainly because those are the least regulated areas of the healthcare system, where you have to deal less with insurance. So I think that there's almost 2 separate questions with regard to healthcare. How well are the systems in Britain and Canada working? And by the way, if I were going to pick a socialized healthcare system that I think works best, I'd pick Switzerland, actually, where there's an actual mandate. But I think that, because it actually is more privatized and there is some competition in the marketplace. But if you're just talking about what could you do to make the American healthcare system better, we're basically at the worst available point. So privatization is here and nationalization is here, we are here. Right? We're just at the low point of the curve. So I think if you move in either direction, it will get better, probably, in certain ways worse. I'm also very much afraid of a government that comes in and is going to have to mandate how doctors care for patients. Because one of the problems that nationalized systems have had is people opting out of that, doctors opting out of caring for patients in this way. They've had to import doctors, for example, in places like Britain. There's a shortage of doctors in places like Israel. Because who wants to go through 1,000 years of medical school to make 60 grand a year?
Shapiro?
Howdy.
I understand that you don't believe in the rape epidemic, and you're trying to prove a point, and I totally understand that, but I believe your facts are misleading. When I heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that there are 6 out of 1,000.
I said the Bureau of Justice Statistics report from 1995 to 2002 reported that the rape rate on college campuses was 6 out of 1,000 women.
Okay, and from those statistics, which I've seen them before, they're from reported actual crimes, right?
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Yes.
Now,
so it's possible, you're right, it's possible the statistics are higher because of unreported crimes, sure.
Okay, well, you answered my question.
But I will also add that I do not think that for every 6 crimes that were reported, there were 244 that were not. Right, so the idea that the statistics that are being cited, 1 out of 5 women is raped, versus 6 out of 1,000, the idea that gap can be crossed simply by people who are not reporting rape, I think that's a large stretch. I'd have to see some statistical evidence to that effect.
You basically answered my question. The reason I want to bring that up is I hope no one listened and believed just everything you said, because your numbers, 6 out of 1,000, it's like shocking. To some people, they hear 1 out of 5, and then all of a sudden it's 6 out of 1,000. It's a big gap.
Well, it is a big gap, and as I say, even if the gap is not 6 out of 1,000, it is not 250 out of 1,000. Right? People are saying 200, 250 out of 1,000. So you're right. It's you know, in terms of women who are not reporting, but I have no way of actually categorizing that. You don't have a statistic either, so you're going to have to give me a stat now. Right? I'm using a stat that actually exists. You're saying that that stat comes up short. I'm acknowledging that there are limitations to that stat, but in order for you to get to there's a rape epidemic, I'm going to need to know what the actual stat is and how you got there.
Oh, hello, Ben. Big fan. I just had one real quick question. Assuming he runs for re-election, who do you think Trump's biggest adversary is for the 2020 election?
I think Biden would probably be the biggest adversary in terms of somebody who could beat him. It's simply because Biden has a lot of blue-collar credibility. For some reason, people seem to like Joe Biden. I've never been able to understand this. But I mean, that's what the polls show anyway. I think age would not be really an obstacle for Biden, considering that the combined age of Donald Trump and Joe Biden takes us back to the Pleistocene era. I think that Biden would probably be their best bet. I think they're going to make a very stupid mistake and nominate the most progressive person they can find. They'll nominate somebody like Kamala Harris or Cory Booker, because Cory Booker shouts and cries. Largely makes a fool of himself in the Senate. But if they were smart, they would nominate Biden. What they would do if they were smart is they would nominate Biden, have him run with somebody like a Kamala Harris or a Cory Booker, and then say, I'm going to serve one term because I'm 70,000 years old. And then just hand it off, second term to somebody else, and then Biden's achieved his life ambition, and he hands it off to the next in line. That's what I would do if I were the Democrats, but I don't want to give them advice. So please, guys, please run Kamala Harris or Cory Booker.
How's it going, Ben?
Pretty well.
Like a true liberal.
Everybody's alive. We're having a good event. No one's been killed. It's great.
So, I don't know. I've assumed your answer to this question, so I assume you're going to oppose me. However, what should be done, if anything, about the lack of proportionality of responsiveness to the middle and lower class by Congress, whereas the working class makes up a large majority of the country but makes up less than 2% of Congress? Misrepresentation leads to lack of responsiveness towards the majority group, regardless of where polarized politics stand. And I believe that your answer would have been, well, just vote or run. But, you know, I think there are issues that surround this in terms of favoring lobbyists and issues such as
So I'm not of the opinion that the class from which you spring determines the quality of your actual candidacy. First of all, the idea that everybody in Congress is rich is not true. There are plenty of people who are in Congress who don't earn a ton of money, and they vary across the spectrum, right? Bernie Sanders is not rich. Dave Brad is not rich. They are completely polar opposites on politics. Dave Brad was making like $100 grand a year as a professor in Virginia, and Bernie Sanders was making whatever you make as a legislator from a commune. For the last 3 decades. So the idea that everybody has to be judged based on their level of income, I find problematic. I also think that the founders were not particularly fond of this idea. I mean, all the founders were quite wealthy, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that you actually have the time to dedicate to the job that you are doing, was the idea, at least in the founding era, and that you could be sort of the statesman and not worry too much about your business. Again, I think that I would judge people much more by their viewpoint than I would by their respective wealth. And the idea that people who are middle class and lower class in America are getting screwed is just not true. The fact is that the people in the lowest classes of America are making, just in terms of public benefits, make a significant amount of money more than people in the upper tier. People in the upper tier are keeping a lot of their own money, but they're also paying, as I said in the speech, 96% of all redistributive programs in the United States, plus the entire budget of the federal government. Because we don't receive anything back, right? I'm now in the upper income earners of the United States. I'm paying a crap load in taxes. I'm getting nothing back from the government. And, you know, I suppose I should say that's fine, but I don't think that's fine. I don't think they should take my money. I don't think they should take my money in the same way I don't think they should have took my money when I was making a lot less money. So your initial assumption was correct, that I don't really care that much, right? I don't actually care the economic class from which you spring, I care the ideas that you promulgate.
Hi. So very much not a fan, but decided to come back anyways.
Okay.
I actually have two questions. The first one is, how do you account for like statistical manipulation when you present your facts that you presented in the beginning? So more specifically, when you were talking about percentages of blacks in X, Y, and Z, and when you were talking about the differences in wages today versus 20 to 50 years ago. How do you account for A, the difference in population among blacks versus whites or other races, and B, how do you account for the increasing gap between the middle class and the upper class?
Okay, so, sorry, two things. There are two questions there. On any given statistic, we'd have a more productive conversation if I could actually give you the source. You could look up the source and then you could ask specific questions about how those numbers were arrived at, because I'm giving you the bottom line, but I'm happy to give you the footnotes. I typically don't do that because it makes the speech even longer and more boring than it already is. But I'm more than happy to argue the stats and whether they're good or not, because it might be like that other guy questioning the Bureau of Justice Statistics stats. Right? There might be a flaw in the stat, and then we can argue about that. So that's a good question. The answer is we'll look at each individual stat and we'll determine whether we think that it's reflective of reality or not based on its internal logic. As far as the idea that how do I account for the gap between the upper class and the non-upper class, as I said, number one, it's not the same people in the upper class. Right? People move up and down between classes fairly regularly in the United States. There is a widening gap in terms of the people who are earning the most and the people who are earning the least, but that's because if you had to make a chart, it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't look like the people at the top are going like that and people at the bottom are going like that. It would look like this, right? People at the bottom are moving up slightly and people at the top are moving up rapidly. That's because investment income has done really well under the stock market, for example. So if you had money to put in the stock market, that's been doing really well for you over the past several years, which suggests that one of the ways to get out of poverty is to save and then get into the stock market. Right? The point here is that when people focus on income inequality, I think that this is actually a rather large moral mistake. I think that focusing on poverty is a good thing to do. I think focusing on income inequality is not a good thing to do because there's no correlation between income inequality and relative rates of poverty. Right? There's tremendous income inequality in a lot of places on planet Earth. In fact, in all places on planet Earth. You go to Sudan, there's going to be a rich warlord there, and then there are going to be a bunch of people living on $6 a year. Okay, that's a terrible place to live. Income inequality in the United States is also quite high, right? There are people who are Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and then there's the local checker at your grocery store. But if the local checker at your grocery store is getting richer, then it seems to me they have nothing particularly to complain about in how the economy is operating. They don't have a right to Jeff Bezos' money. They don't have a right to Bill Gates' money any more than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos has a right to their money. So the question shouldn't be relative rates of increase. The question should be, is your income increasing? Is your life getting better? Can you buy more cool stuff? And one of the problems I have with just measuring income by the pure dollar amount is that it doesn't actually measure what you can buy with those dollars. Right? The fact is that you can buy things today that you couldn't buy even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 or 20 years ago. Life is completely transformed. A poor person in the United States today is living better than a rich person was living in the United States in 1920. Right? They all have, everybody has air conditioning, everybody has a microwave, everybody has a car, everybody has a TV or two. Right? All of these things did not exist. That's because the market has created new products for which there is demand. It does not mean that poverty has been completely solved, because I think it's going to be almost impossible to completely solve poverty, but it does mean that if you're complaining because people at the upper end are getting richer, rather than because you're getting poorer, then you should look to whether you are operating on the basis of jealousy or whether you're operating on the basis of something that actually should matter.
Just like as a woman and somebody going into the healthcare field, I personally don't, it's on your opinion on abortion. I personally don't think that like I could have an abortion just because morally I feel like for myself it wouldn't be the right choice. But how do you defend your opinion as a white, well-off, religious man? How do you defend your, telling a woman what she can do with her body?
Because evil things are still evil, even if I'm a white, well-off religious man. And politics points that I really, I don't mean to come down harsh The reason being that the people who were fighting against enslavement of black people were a bunch of well-off white men, for the most part. Right? And those people were saying, this is a moral sin. This is a moral blot. They weren't living in the South. They didn't own plantations. They didn't live the lives of the plantation owners. They said, this is evil, and we are here to stop it. Right? When you see something that you think is morally wrong happening, especially when you're talking about the taking of a human life, like, listen, I think that you shouldn't go around randomly killing homeless people. I just have this view. I'm not a homeless person. Most of the people who randomly kill homeless people are probably not of my economic strata, my religious view, or my, I don't know whether they're of my skin color or not. I have no idea what the actual sociological breakdown of homeless killer serial murderers is. But I would suggest that my identity has nothing to do with what is right or wrong. And this is what Western civilization used to give out. Western reason. And the nature of wrong about what's right and wrong, and that I don't retreat into my identity. If we don't retreat into our identity, and our morality is now centered around that identity, morality doesn't exist at all. We break down into a society of fragmented atoms where I can't even say, like, a puppy to say about that. I'm not a white woman who's in the healthcare field. I'm not going to, I would surrender the idea that the color of the nature of my genitalia, and honestly, I believe any view that feels differently is sexist, racist, and bigoted.
My name is Jonathan. According to statistics, millennials are more likely to be lean Democrat, or now socialism is on the rise. How do we convey conservatism to them and show them the light?
I mean, I think that the biggest problem, there are two big problems with millennials. One is that they have lived in a society where socialism has never really been a thing. Right? I mean, most people who are older lived in a society where the Soviet Union was an existential threat. And when people said, hey, look, socialism, they would point to the USSR. Look at that giant gulag state. And everybody go, oh, that sucks, that's terrible. Capitalism must be better than that. And people who are our age, they look at socialism and they go, oh, that means Denmark. It doesn't mean Denmark, guys. Okay, Denmark is not socialist. Denmark has a redistributive welfare net. That's not the same thing as socialism. But even that is a very strong capitalistic system, which is why Denmark, until very recently, had a lower corporate tax rate than the United States and far less business regulation. They can afford a 60% tax rate on their population only because their economy is good thanks to capitalistic views with regard to drawing in business. So people just don't know enough about economics to actually make these statements. That's number one. Number two is that people on the right do not make a moral case with regard to economics. So if you're a millennial, what you tend to hear, everybody to get a view of my back, what people on the left tend to hear from people on the left about social is the right thing to do. That wouldn't it be more moral if you were both not quite as polarized on the spectrum? You know, if you have $10, does it really hurt you to give up 2 to that guy who has $3? And aren't you both better off now? And the answer is, just because in the first place, there's something moral to okay, that's not true. I don't know how you got your money. Maybe you worked your way up from poverty. Maybe you made a lot of money because you invented some new GMO that allowed billions of people to be fed. Right? In that case, you deserve the money. And guess what? You deserve the money in a free market economy because people were willing to engage in a voluntary transaction with you. Voluntary transactions, consent. This is the nature of capitalism. Seizure of property, seizure of wealth, force, compulsion. These are the nature of socialism. That's the argument that conservatives should be making. And if you want to win the day on economics, that's the argument you should be making as well.
This is our last question. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, guys.
Hello, Ben. My name is Joe. I'm holding my phone because I'm recording for my dad. He's a big fan, so he says hi.
That's how I say hi.
Yeah.
Hey, Dad. How's it going?
So I have 2 pretty serious points to address. In 2016, you had put out a list of people that you thought were characterized to be alt-right. And one of them happened to be a philosopher who I hold pretty highly, Ron Paul. And I was kind of curious, why you put Ron Paul on that list? Just because Ron Paul was one of the people that did inspire me to conservatism.
Right, so Ron Paul's libertarian views on government I'm largely in agreement with, and that's not what makes him alt-right on that list. What made him alt-right on that list was a sense of identity politics that amounted to him engaging in relatively open anti-Semitism, unfortunately. Ron Paul wrote for an anti-Semitic newsletter in Texas. He wrote a book in which he equated anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and then basically said that he was anti-Zionist. He's been involved with soft-pedaling members of the alt-right for a long time. I think that the idea of him as a pure alt-right figure might be a bit of an exaggeration. Maybe you want to say that he is friendly to the alt-right. At least a lot on the alt-right are friendly to him. But the relationship in terms of foreign policy, I would say he's a paleocon who verges on alt-right. Not everybody who's paleo, maybe you're right. Maybe the idea is that he's not fully alt-right because he doesn't espouse a white supremacist view are superior to other people, but he is fully in line with an anti-Semitic view that views Israel as the font of all evil in the Western world, and he has given aid and comfort to a lot of folks on the alt-right. So I think that's probably a fair criticism.
And for my second point, this is the more serious one. Do you think you're more handsome than Tom Cruise?
Yeah. My wife does, which to me is the only thing that matters. I mean, as long as I'm good with my wife, I'm a happy camper. So I think I'm more handsome than Tom Cruise. That's a new one.